Our final speaker for today, and just as a heads up too, there will be networking drinks outside at the end. So there's that to look forward to if you're thirsty and feeling the need of some reinvigoration. But I'm sure Cerasela Stancu's talk will also reinvigorate you before a drink. And Cerasela is going to talk to us about the critical role of accounting in proactively managing fresh water. Cerasela has over 25 years of experience working on environment and sustainable development issues with organisations across Europe, Asia and New Zealand. She has worked extensively with government and private sector to bring solutions and perspectives to the table on issues regarding sustainability and the integration of natural capital and ecosystem services in policy and business decisions. In recent years, she has increasingly focused on landscape-level, at-scale, nature-based solutions, working at the interface between climate adaptation and mitigation, ecosystems and economy. So hopefully we will now see and hear from Cerasela.
All right. Thank you very much. So if we can maybe go to the slide. Yes, perfect. Thank you. I'll be watching the chat in case there are more problems. So that's really the where we see as the bigger context around water issue. And for New Zealand, just in terms of comparison, if you want, with the wider global context, we are already exceeding the risk threshold in terms of both water use, but also water quality, recognizing that a lot of our policy efforts at the moment have been focused on quality primarily, but there is a strong connection between quantity and quality in terms of the impacts that we have. If we can move to the next one, please. Overall, in terms of where the water accounting and what I'm going to talk today, going through a few concepts, but also looking at the experience in Hawke's Bay. It's water accounting, it really truly is the fundamentals of accounting. It's as if we're using financial accounting to support better management decisions and governance decisions in a lot of aspects. So in some ways with water accounting is also, we look at it as the connection between how we manage resources, the policies that we develop, not just in relation to water, but assets more broadly. And I recognize here that given what we've learned and what we've heard today in terms of, cultural values and how do we reflect on Maori values and the aspirations of Tangata and Mana Whenua, there are things that we need to enhance in the way we do water accounting so that it's not just a biophysical exercise as such. So moving on to the next slide. Keep going, please, to the next one. Now, starting with water accounting today, over the weekend, this is just to bringing it into the context. This is an article that was published in a website called interest.co.nz. And that's generally, they cover a wide range of issues. And this article was about the fact that in New Zealand, right now, we do still have, despite the focus on water so much, we still lack good data that will support good decision making. And the question there was raised around, is there appropriate public accountability if we don't have good data? And that's, in my view, in fact, one of the immediate benefits or a key purpose why we want better water accounting being driven in regional council accounting and government accounting and so on is around the fact that we need to start with better transparency. So to have these conversations like we've had today, to be able to come up with new ideas, it all starts with having better transparency. And this was a good article actually raising this issue. If we can move, please, to the next slide. Now, Ministry for the Environment, a few years back, they did put out a guide on freshwater accounting, and they specifically listed the type of decisions that they believe that water accounting is being useful to. And as you can see, it's pretty comprehensive list there, including the fact that water accounting will be useful in terms of making investment decisions. And we've heard even earlier today about the fact that with some of the changes that we're looking at in terms of water reforms and so on, the question of having that ability to recognize return on investment and the cost of water and so on, it's important. And therefore, accounting is linked to that, but it's not the full answer. If we can move through the next slide, please. Now, water accounting, it really is part of that wider, what we consider the natural capital framework accounting. So, and water, like I already said, is not just a valuable asset and a valuable, cultural value that we place to it, but it is also linked to the role it has as an ecosystem service, including water purification, which so many of our natural ecosystems provide. And they ensure us, as we've learned even in the presentation before my presentation, around how we can work with ecosystems to increase resilience and not rely so much on engineering solutions alone. And then, of course, there are all the societal benefits that we draw from natural assets. So water accounting is part of that broader picture that we need to recognize. Next slide, please. Now, for the work that we've done in this accounting space, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and there is no need to reinvent the wheel. So every time when we talk about the fact, including now, the fact that we need templates that will ensure better accounting for water and comparability and ability to benchmark between industries, between communities, and so on. We don't need to start and come up with solutions from the scratch, because we already have a lot of templates, if you want, and statistical way of actually accounting for water. And we can build that and connect with our system of national accounts. So therefore, bringing communities, water, and economics together in systems that are compatible, if you want, and easier to make decisions and drive changes throughout the system. And that's what the system of what we call system of environmental economic accounts, which is a UN system that all countries follow. We've applied a lot of these templates coming from this system because it's this belief that it's more efficient. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, and it resonates with a lot more parties. Moving on. Perhaps mindful of the time. What we've done in terms of the water accounts to date, we focused on the physical flows, stocks and flows of water. Natural water assets, those are the stocks. So all of the water that we capture in our rivers, in our lakes, soil water, groundwater, and including artificial ponds, artificial reservoirs. And then it's about the supply and use. So essentially, how much water do we take from the environment? How is it being used in the economy? And then where do we return that water back into the environment? Because that water, though part of it evaporates, majority of it is going to go back into the environment. It's just that often it's not going to go back into the place where we extracted it from, and also it's going to have a different quality. So therefore, we have all those impacts. And I've talked already about some of the benefits or the way that water accounting is being used, including the fact that it can be is being applied in pricing strategies, including how we make investments. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we've already kind of articulated this. We've heard today, and I think Stu in the presentation before me, he talked quite a bit about the water cycle, the water balance, and the fact that generally there is even for, if you want, economic environmental accounting, we do rely on the water hydrological cycle. It's everything about, where is the water coming from, how it's being stored in terms of assets, the lakes, the aquifers, and so on, how much evapotranspiration we have happening. And this is important because it's precipitation, which is a key source of the water that we use. And that also the water that replenishes assets like aquifers that we extract water from, but also with increasing climate change, we see massive changes and in patterns, including in the evapotranspiration. So these are things that can really, changes in the hydrological cycle is then going to impact in the way we have access to it and the water stocks that are available to us for use. And some key water accounting language for now that I recognize many of you there are familiar with this because you work on water issues all the time. But we're talking here about, concepts like abstraction of water, meaning the water that we take from the environment. Received water, often in accounting, it means water that is actually coming from other economic units, and also distribution or extracting water for our own use versus abstracting water for distributing to others. So all of this is language that is used in this accounting, if you want, frameworks, a little bit like financial language. If we can move on to the next slide. In New Zealand, the one reason why we focus in this UN SEEA framework for water accounting is the fact that we already have efforts by Stats NZ to build a system of environmental economic accounts in a way that, we capture more and more of the natural assets. So we already have a top-down, if you want, stock take of water accounts, so availability, how much water we have by regions in New Zealand. It's just that the statistics at national level for now cannot give us the granularity that we really need at a regional level, at a district level or catchment level to make, to inform different type of decisions. So water accounting is not a decision-making tool as such. It really supports, engagement and other decisions. And this is to recognize the expansion that we have in terms of data with Statistics New Zealand, but also the need to further that. When we look across, for example, at Australia, but also a number of countries in Europe and so on, there is extensive use of the UN SEEA water accounting methodology. Obviously, in places like Australia, they perhaps focused a lot more on this because for them, the water crisis in some ways and water scarcity has been an issue that emerged perhaps much earlier than here, and therefore they had a need to apply this much more standardized way for accounting for water earlier than us. So there is plenty of experience for us in New Zealand to look across the pond and, apply here or adapt or even lessons what not to do in water accounting. Moving to the next slide. So now I'm coming to where the context here for Hawke's Bay region. And it's been really, because this is the first time where we apply the UN SEEA water guidance in a systematic way. I just cannot say, the appreciation that I have and the team here at EnviroStrat working with Hawke's Bay Regional Council, working with the districts, and the engagement we've had with a number of experts in the region and beyond to try and really navigate this way for doing something for the first time, right? So we don't have a benchmark of how to do it. So it's been really learning by doing. And that's why we call this a first experiment in water accounting in New Zealand, because that's what it was. And just for those of you in terms of Hawke's Bay, just very quickly, we have a series of catchments, some of them much larger than others and involving, much more intense water use. And then all of those catchments, they're generally linked to 4 territorial authorities. So we've worked with Napier City, Hastings District, Central Hawke's Bay, and also Wairoa District. Moving on to the next slide, please. The entire process for accounting has been a process of really data gathering by and large. So, as the terminology of accounting sounds a little bit boring, in some ways it is that intensity of data gathering as if you're doing financial accounts. And it is about actually, cleaning the data, ensuring that we are using the same units, we're comparing the same things, and also organizing the data in a way that can fit into a template of water accounting that makes sense. So in that way, we've used a lot of the internal data sources that are coming through IRIS, Resource Consents Database, for those of you in the room that are already familiar with that. But we also, at the time when we've done this accounting pilot, if you want, it was also the time when conversations around three waters were starting. So there was a lot of data requirements being placed on district councils and regional district councils in particular from DEA. And we've made use to some extent of data coming from that source as well. It has not been easy because, as you know, we are dealing with resource consents, with information that is being captured in some ways over years and years. And so you always have to think about consistency, but more importantly, because the water accounts is an environmental economic accounting exercise, it was also about actually translating volumes of water and connecting that with our statistics codes so that we can connect water use with specific sectors and specific uses, in the idea that in the future, we can actually not only say, how much of water is being used for what purpose, but potentially also apply a social and monetary value to it, so that, those of you that will be in a position to, guide decisions around, should we use the water for horticulture versus how much should we allocate to a different use and so on, have the information that you're able to debate such decisions and ultimately make decisions. So we can see here that this classification with ANSI, it's not an easy one because it requires actually collecting data and the resource consent slightly different. And we already talked about consistency in the data that comes through resource consents. And now we are adding another layer of complexity saying, oh, we should also take into account economic sector codes and be able to build that into the way of the resource consent. So in a lot of ways, the entire reform that and changes we are going through right now perhaps gives us the ability to ensure that we make these linkages as we are preparing for such a major change in our resource management. Next slide, please. This is a high-level slide to show the interaction, if you want, between the economy and our hydrological water system, and how everything is in fact connected. Not only is connected on land, but it's of course connected to the atmosphere. And you can see how complex the interactions are and how multiple interactions we're dealing with, and therefore also the data that we have to pull together to be able to reflect on all these interactions. And like I said, it's not just biophysical, it's not just economic data, it's also biophysical data, and we have to make sense of it all. Furthermore, because we are talking about water accounts for a region, and in our case, we focused on district councils, but for water assets, we also focused on catchments as a unit of measurement, if you want, for water assets. That adds another dimension, because for every single unit of accounting, whether it is the region, the district, or a catchment, you have water in and water out, and there are multiple uses within that biophysical unit. So accounting for all of this takes a little bit of system organizing, but it can be done. Next slide, please. And this is trying to, because I've talked so much about how critical data is, this is a slide that really reflects the complexity of data from a regional perspective, if you want, recognizing that there are multiple data holders within the system of accounting. And that also we're using, in terms of data, we have anything from measured data, which would be the most robust, reliable data that we can work with, the metered consumption and takes and so on, versus some of the model data, or somewhere in between. In the case of the work we've done in places, we had to use assumptions, and we've extrapolated some of the measured data. In other cases, we've downscaled, if you want, modeling efforts to be able to do the accounting exercise. And like I mentioned, again, the only parts that we focused in terms of water account for the region were the accounting for water assets and then accounting for physical supply and use tables. If you can see, it's in the right hand of the screen. Ideally, in the future, we'd also want to be able to account for quality of water. In other words, the environmental loads that go to with the quantities. Next slide, please. We'll go, I'm mindful of the time, so if we can move on quicker. Next slide. And these are the results. So, talking so much about water accounts and the fact that we can use templates and tables, this is a template with a, initial results, if you want, first generation water accounts for Hawke's Bay region. You can see from this table the way data is being organized. So you have initially on the vertical, if you want, columns, the data is organized by sectors. We account for households separately. And by that, I mean those households that will take water from the environment, not reticulated to the water system, but they will have, water tanks and other means. And then at the bottom part, well, the first part of the table is everything to do with the water that we abstract from the environment. And we've come up with some sort of structure in terms of Hawke's Bay that recognizes, if you want, the current use of water. So we have, livestock as an item there because it's an important water user activity. But that can be adjusted depending on the context. And then at the bottom part of this table is the water used within the economy. So it's what we take from the environment for use, but also what we use within the economy. And just reflecting on what we've heard a little bit earlier, the fact that, ideally we would want to reuse water within the economy much more. And, if you look at the information in this table, for example, we couldn't really, there isn't reliable data or data that would help us fill out this item, which the data simply doesn't exist. But it is what water accounts would enable a system to do once data is available and is being collected. One other thing, very briefly to say, the different coloring that you see on this table, it's really reflecting the quality of the data. So where you see red, that means that it's either data that has been, numbers that have been estimated, or some, major assumptions have been made. And then where you see green, that will be the most reliable data that we worked with. Maybe because, primarily because it was coming out of resource consents with metered devices. On to the next slide. This is, again, what happens with the water when it goes back into the environment. And at times we know much less about that. But we've tried again, it's the sort of work that will be needed in terms of enhancement of this exercise. And it is a powerful information to really know where you got the water from, what's being used for, but also where it goes back into the environment after it's being used. And if we can, and overall at the bottom of the table, really it tells us what is the balance, how much is being consumed within a calendar year. I forgot to mention that these numbers that you see with the last two tables, they represent a financial year. So it was an accounting done from July 2019 to June 2020. On to the next slide. This is a slide that we, together with Tom Skerman at Hawke's Bay Regional Council, we're trying really hard to think, how do we actually communicate easier what water accounts is about? You know, can we come up with a visual that people will understand better than this endless spreadsheets that I showed you, which are really just the pinnacle of all of the spreadsheets that we had behind those two tables. And this is one of the visuals where we're trying in a schematic way to show where is the water coming from the environment, to what type of economic activities and uses is going, and then, you know, how is it being returned back to the environment, and try to put numbers everywhere we're able to. But you can see even here that we have a lot of reds and question marks because we couldn't fully determine that. But as let's say, functional, logical way of understanding many numbers, it seemed to us that that's a way to understand in an easier way how accounting for water can be useful. Moving on to the next slide, please. This is I won't spend time on this, but this is more to say that there are difficulties in terms of how we take apart data that's coming out of resource consent. So for example, the rules used in agriculture and the fact that we have irrigation that often serves different purposes and so on. We're trying to make sense using consent data and aligning it with ANSI codes. We're trying to reorganize data in a way that it can tell us with much more detail, if you want, how water is being used in a region. Based on resource consents primarily, and then we can add to that also some of the estimates we've done around permitted activities and so on. Next slide, please. This is more, the next couple of slides is more to say, to show how water accounting can be used to communicate for different purposes and so on. So this is actually showing the water use by the different sectors. Next slide. Likewise here, and I would point that this is, you know, we're trying to look at average water use per capita for Hawke's Bay districts. But you recognize from this slide, this is not with the intention of saying, let's compare the districts to each other, because these districts have got very different economic profile. It's not about household water use, but you can see the difference in terms of how much water is being extracted, if you want, in relation to the people, driven by and large by the economic activities. I'm not sure how much more time I have, but let's keep going. Further, please. This is the second, next slide, please. Similar to the tables that I've showed before, which were focusing on the supply and use of water, so you know how much we take from the environment and so on. This is actually a water table accounting for the water that is available in the water assets. And the UN SEEA for water accounts recommends the use of, six water assets. The artificial reservoirs, so that can be any of the ponds on farms and so on. The lakes, rivers, water that is held in snow, if that's the case. Here you see some numbers for Hawke's Bay because it captures a little bit of topo. And then of course, groundwater and soil water. Behind these numbers is actually a lot of methodological, if you want, effort. It's also some big assumptions that we've made to be able to come up with this accounting. It's been a collaboration with NIWA and also a consulting company, WGS, based in Christchurch, to do the groundwater accounting. It deserves in some ways a presentation in its own right. But these are numbers that we came up with that show how much is available in an asset, recognizing that groundwater, those large numbers that we see there, many of that water is not economically, if you want, accessible. It can be accessed in physical terms, but it doesn't make sense in terms of the cost and energy that would go to go very deep. On to the next slide, please. A key point to make around the water assets is the fact that these assets are not isolated and that the entire water system is connected. So there is an exchange of flows between them. And during the project, what was interesting to us being out in catchments is when you'd go at times and you'd hear, let's say, if you are a farmer, or if you are, you might live in a catchment somewhere and you say, oh, it's been so much extraction of water from the river that my bores, or from groundwater, that now my bores are running dry. So we could see the tension that it doesn't mean necessarily that was true, but that people make in the day-to-day life, these connections between assets is being made. However, we have not very good information that will actually show what is the exchange of flows between the different assets. And that again is important for making good decisions. And the only places perhaps where we've done some of this work, looking at exchanges in particular, have been those catchments where water pressures are very, very high. And I think someone mentioned Tuki earlier today. But it's again a lot of work that needs to go so that we have reliable, robust data showing the interchange, interdependencies between the assets. And moving on, please. I will skip indicators development simply because the indicators are just ideas around what we can use in terms of water assets calculations, what indicators can be more meaningful to communicate and to engage better. And there are a range of indicators. If we can please go to the next slide. You can see here a range of indicators that can be used. And once again, I recognize that because of the experience to date, not just globally, not just in New Zealand, we are not very good at recognizing Maori values, indigenous values, and therefore some of these indicators, need themselves a refresh, and they need to be expanded. Our lenses with how we see water accounting has to be enhanced. Right, so keep going with the slide. Next one, please. Now, overall, in a very quick sort of wrap up of this big exercise in Hawke's Bay, where we've worked with a team at Hawke's Bay Regional Council and others in the region. It is the first attempt in New Zealand to conduct a systematic water accounting exercise at the regional level. We focus just on supply and use and water assets. Overall, it is very clear that in doing so, we can support better decision-making. It can enhance transparency, but it also, water accounting really responds to this recognized need, and we've heard over and over again today, for better monitoring and tracking of freshwater stocks, but also how we use and so on. So it is definitely an effective and efficient tool to be used in the context of water policy and management decisions in New Zealand. There are learnings and there are enhancements that we need to make, but this has been, a first try, first generation. So as far as an initial test goes, we all believe that there are interesting insights by having such extent of data being pulled together in some cohesive tables. And then there is scope for improvements, a lot of scope for improvements, including around the fact that, we need to have that ability of actually bringing ecosystem and water quality and cultural values into this accounting exercise, because it's all connected and we cannot take volume, we cannot treat volumes alone separate from the rest of the system. Another, if you want practical insight, and this is around the interventions, what to focus on when we are aiming to improve data quality. And I want to just put this across because earlier today we heard about the fact that, we don't have good quality data, that allocation into the next new system that we are preparing for, it's still, there are many decisions to be made. One if you want, wisdom is that if we want to improve data, perhaps the best way is to channel interventions and resources towards high use, high leakage industries, but also specific users depending on the interest. It feels that that's a sensible approach, and that will meet a need in the current RMA reforms that we're talking about. On to the next. I think there are a few other things here around data and so on, but I'll rather stop here in the idea that maybe there is one or two questions, and I'm sorry for this rush, trying to get through a bit of material. Hopefully this presentation will be shared, and those of you that want to talk more are welcome. But for now, I would wrap up here. Thank you, thanking you very much for the patience and attention as the last speaker of the day. And if there is time for question.
Hi, Cerasela. You spoke about the system of economic environmental accounting. How do you distinguish between the residential principle and the territorial principle of accounting when water that's in one region is being used in another region? So how would you reconcile the water use?
So it's not so much about reconciling, it's actually, it goes back to very good biophysical data. So in the case of this work that we've done on Hawke's Bay, thinking about interaction and the fact that we have catchments, if you want, freshwater management units versus administrative units, districts and so on. And those do not, they don't necessarily overlap. They don't overlap, right? So that's, again, there are accounting, if you want, methodologies around how to do that. But in our case, we've also made some strong assumptions. So when I'm saying that, there is learning to out of this and still learning to take place is the fact that, with some of these assumptions that we've made, are they correct? Can we do it better? Can NEWA's top water model for New Zealand, with some of the assumptions there, is that correct? Can we enhance that? So it's a technical question, and I would love to take that separately. It can be done, but it requires better data than we currently have. And the way we tackled it in this particular exercise was to make some strong assumptions.
And then one question that was on the chat, but it's dropped off the version I've got. But the question was, and you did have a sort of simple slide, but how do communities or iwi or hapu explain this in a simple way to their whānau? And is there work going on? I'm assuming that Māori in the region have been involved in this project to date. Work going on to get it readily understood, and therefore, once people can understand it, they can apply it.
Yes. So where we are in terms of this project, it was undertaken as a desktop research. Mainly because in some ways we were, some of these accounting templates and so on, were all of us learning through them, but also because of resources, timeline and so on. So it's a question now, how do we take this desktop exercise in the wider context, and how do we engage and how do we communicate to stakeholders, right? So accounting, as the name says, in some ways, the rules of accounting are established in a much bigger system. It's more what to do to improve the data, and then what we do with what we learn from these tables. And this is why we're trying to do that visual, to think, if we are to engage with people that, don't spend their life thinking about water management and accounting and so on and decisions, how do we communicate easily? And this is what we're trying to do. And actually, SEEA has a very easy to understand template in terms of build around sectors, explaining, how you take the water from the environment, how it's being used within the economy and by us, people, for our own interests and needs, and then how we put it back. I believe that that's where we can do more work around how we communicate, and especially how we use visuals to engage. But this is still work to come, really. And I I'd be very keen to engage, and that's why I feel so sorry not being able to be in the room, because it'll be a different level of connecting to those of you that, they might see the potential of how water accounting can be used to engage with your own, within Hawke, WHANA, with your own constituents and stakeholders.
It's very much one step at a time, and we have to start somewhere. So
Correct.
We just have one question
Oh.
here. Naho just raised his hand, and I'll just ask Naho if you could talk, so if you can unmute yourself.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora, thank you for that. I used to work for Statistics New Zealand as well, and we have looked at the basically the accounting information, particularly for management of the groundwater and the Heretaunga, basically the in and out flows, and we've referred to the most recently available data, or data that we've had available, and it highlighted a severe over allocation. I know you're talking in terms of abstraction, but and that allocation is higher than that, but it showed some worrying trends and details. So this has actually been a debate point in hearings, and we're actually going to Environment Court, because basically the approach has been, because that was the information that was theirs and using, and it showed that there's basically been bad management. The defence of council was not to use that measuring water use based on ins and outs wasn't a good approach to go to. It's all for public record, it's all for evidence. In fact, they had to retract the evidence from their top hydrologists because it aligned with our whakaaro and our evidence, and that's all on record, and the hydrologist quit the day of the hearings. So it's very, very contentious, and we don't get the data, and we haven't been involved. I work for the largest iwi, and like I say, I've experience with this, and I know we've been through court, but we just want a kind of clear, logical method to, like this proposes accounts for what do we have, what is used within a te mano o te wai framework, and not necessarily, I mean, it's quite hard on the ear to hear what are referred like assets, but I understand the accounting matrix, and it's actually part of, it's sort of dangerous territory when it moves into the what they used to call the overs and unders approach, or averaging out water inequality. I know this is the water quantity aspect, but it actually had been policy not to use the accounting regime for management decisions or share the information. So I'm just a bit worried that it's not been open and transparent with us, because we'd like to have a genuine discussion and we can understand, interpret it for ourselves, and there's some real risks. And I just sent you a chat because we're also involved in some research about the groundwater recharge rate, and the most recent research with Lincoln Agritech and NIWA in the country that shows that the way that the gravel in the river has been managed, that it's not recharging at the rate that it used to be, or is now assumed, which means that not only is potentially more water being used given the policy framework, but also that the assumptions on how much water is going into our biggest natural reservoir is overstated. So we, putting aside all the rain at the moment, but that can cause quite significant problems with the incorrect data, or that there's a bit of a political influence not to shed light, and this research we're involved in is basically not being taken up through the decision-making panel. So so how do we ensure integrity of what you're proposing here?
We might, and maybe you could take that offline. I'm just conscious we're now 10 minutes over time, but Niall, if certainly you and Cerasela could get in touch offline and discuss those points, because they could be useful to both of you by the sounds of things. But thank you very much, Cerasela. We will stop it there. And thank you for your talk and for the insights you've had into the accounting. And it certainly seems like there's much to be done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It's been lovely. Any questions, please? I'm happy to engage offline. And wishing you a very nice evening. I'm sorry I'm not there for the drinks, and I hope to meet some of you at one point in the future.
Thank you very much. Kia ora.